Hi everybody, I'm Ryan, and that's Misa. She's walking away now, but she was silently judging me, as is her duty. Keeps me in line. Today we're going to talk about 5-color creativity. Specifically, we're going to do a deep dive on 5-color creativity. It's been my primary modern deck for a while, and I feel like I have a pretty good grasp on the ins and outs and builds and flex slots and gameplay and goals and sideboarding of 5-color creativity. We're going to be looking at all of those things, and I'll be showing you my current build of 5-color and why I'm doing this build. The first step is a sort of in-depth deck tech. In order to do that, I'm going to show you the build that I am currently playing. Now, the goal of 5-color creativity is to cast either Indomitable Creativity or Transmogrify. Indomitable Creativity is 3 red and X. For some reason, I can't zoom in. It says destroy X target artifacts and or creatures. For each permanent destroyed this way, its controller reveals cards from the top of their library until an artifact or creature card is revealed and exiles that card. Though players put the exiled cards onto the battlefield, then shuffle. And Transmogrify is 4 mana, exile target creature. That creature's controller reveals cards from the top of their library until they reveal a creature card. That player puts the card into the battlefield and shuffles the rest into their library. So both of these cards effectively do the same thing for us. The big difference is Transmogrify can only target one thing and can only target creatures, where Creativity can target multiple things for a little bit more mana and target creatures and artifacts. They both get rid of the thing that it's targeting and then reveals cards from the top of the library until we reveal an artifact or creature card, just creature if it's Transmogrify. The only artifact or creature that we play in our deck is Archon of Cruelty, which is a 8 mana 6/6 with flying. This is whenever Archon of Cruelty enters the battlefield or attacks, target opponent sacrifices a creature or planeswalker, discard a card and loses 3 life, you draw a card and gain 3 life. So it's really a 3/4 card if you count the card entering the battlefield swing. And that's the core of the deck, is to resolve an Indomitable Creativity or Transmogrify, get an Archon or a few Archons onto the battlefield as fast as possible. It sounds simple because it is. It is essentially a 1-card combo, but we have to have some deck building restrictions, and the question remains, how do we get an artifact and or creature onto the battlefield if we're not allowed to play artifact and or creatures? Now, the primary way that we do this is Dwarven Mine. Dwarven Mine is a land that when it enters the battlefield tapped, unless you control 3 or more other mountains, and when Dwarven Mine enters the battlefield untapped, create a 1/1 red dwarf creature token. Notice as well that Dwarven Mine is a mountain itself. So all of our lands, besides fetch lands, are mountains. We get 3 lands onto the battlefield, and then we fetch a Dwarven Mine with one of our fetch lands, because all of our fetch lands are red. Because it's a mountain, we can grab Dwarven Mine, it enters untapped, we get a dwarf. We can even do this on our opponent's end step so that sorcery speed removal cannot hit this dwarf. Other ways that we do it is through Fable of the Mirror Breaker. The 2/2 red goblin shaman that it makes when you play Fable, you can target with Creativity and Transmog. When it attacks, it creates treasures, which you can target with Creativity. And when it flips, turned into Reflection of Kiki-Jiki, we can target it with Creativity and Transmogrify. Now we get this sort of pseudo-endless supply of dwarves. We really only have access to 4 because we can play 4 Dwarven Mines, because we're able to get lands back over and over with Wrenn and 6. Wrenn and 6 is our favorite 2-mana planeswalker, starts at 3 loyalty. Its +1 is return up to 1 target land card from your graveyard to your hand. That's the big one that we're going to be using. It lets us hit land drops, which is really important because all of our lands have to be red because of the Dwarven Mine clause. And so getting fetch lands back to fetch out our other colors, since we're a 5-color deck, really, I mean, we're kind of a 4-color deck plus Archon, but because we're a 5-color deck, we need to make sure we get all of our colors. It's -1, deals 1 damage to any target, really good against Ragavan. I have finished opponents off before, finished off Planeswalkers, stuff like that. And if we ever get it all the way up to its -7, you get an emblem that's with instant and sorcery cards in your graveyard have Retrace. Now, this is really sweet because we can recast Creativity and Transmog from our graveyard. Retrace effectively says that we can discard a land and pay a spell's normal cost that's in our graveyard, an instant sorcery card in our graveyard, and just cast that spell. One kind of cool thing about Retrace that's a little different than Flashback is Retrace means that it doesn't get exiled, so you can keep casting it over and over. So primarily when you ult Wrenn and 6, really the way you're going to be killing our opponent is through a lightning bolt being in our graveyard. We're probably going to have a lot of lands in our hand because we've been plussing Wrenn and 6 a whole bunch by the time we get to -7. If we have a single lightning bolt in our graveyard, all of our lands are red. We tap 1 land, discard a land of our hand, bolt you face. Discard a land, tap a red source, bolt you in the face. And just do that until our opponent is dead. And that's how a lot of these games end when Wrenn and 6 actually ults, which is a cool alternate win condition when we can't get an Archon onto the battlefield. So how do we protect that combo? Because while it's a really easy combo to put together, it's interruptible because both Transmogrify and Indomitable Creativity fizzle if you kill the target. So if you kill the dwarf in response, or dwarves in response, it doesn't resolve. Also, counter magic is obviously good against us. So how do we deal with that? Number one is being patient and casting Indomitable Creativity for more than one. That makes removal really bad against us, or they have to devote 2 or 3 cards into making Indomitable Creativity not resolve. And we're totally okay with like a 2 or 3 for 1 trade with Indomitable Creativity if they have to do it with removal. Other ways that we protect our combo is Spell Pierce. Spell Pierce, just 1 mana, counter target non-creature spell, and that's controller pays 2. If we know they only have 1 piece of interaction, we get to 5 mana, creativity for 1 on our dwarf. Spell Pierce, or 6 mana, creativity for 2 on 2 dwarfs, protected with Spell Pierce. Spell Pierce is also excellent in foiling our opponent's game plans. Most decks are super reliant on non-creature spells, and Spell Pierce being able to leave just 1 mana up is amazing. Actually, Spell Pierce is the big reason why we're playing 2 Steam Vents. Being able to use our blue for something, like casting Teferi Time Reveler, or being able to leave 2 Spell Pierce up in order to kind of stop our opponent from doing stuff, or even protect our combo, or protect resolving a Planeswalker or anything like that is really important. And being able to play a Steam Vents and a fetch land and almost definitely have 2 Spell Pierce up is really important, especially since we're a 5-color deck and it's kind of hard to get multiple of a color besides red. Speaking of our lands are primarily fetch lands, Dwarven Mine. We're playing 1 of each red shock land, plus 2 Steam Vents for the reasons that we just talked about. And we're playing 2 Triomes, Jetmir's Garden, and Xander's Lounge. So the reason we are playing these Triomes is, assuming we don't have anything to play, we almost definitely always want to fetch Jetmir's Garden first, because when we untap, we can either play another fetch land for Steam Vents, be able to have access to our primary 4 colors and cast Wrenn and 6, be able to cast Reprieve, cast Lightning Bolt, cast Spell Pierce, we have access to a lot of stuff, or we can fetch a Xander's Lounge and be able to cast Leyline Binding for 1. And that's normally how the first few turns goes. Of course, it alters if you draw a shock land or draw a Triome or something like that instead of just playing fetches and being able to play perfect. But you kind of have to use your intuition in understanding that. Again, ideally, it's Jetmir's Garden first, and then either Steam Vents or Xander's Lounge second. But remember, these are mountains, so they go along really, really well with Dwarven Mine. Other ways that we protect our combo, to kind of go back to what we were just talking about. Teferi Time Raveler, I like playing it as a 4 of. It stops these Cascade decks, which, especially the Rhinos deck, is a little bit rough for us. It says each opponent can only cast spells only at any time they can cast a sorcery. It's +1 is until your next turn, you may cast sorcery spells with those they have flash. -3, return up to 1 target artifact, owner, creature, or enchantment to its owner's hand, draw a card. There's a lot of cool stuff you can do with Teferi Time Raveler. Like, you can slow your opponent down with its minus. Remember, you can return Urza Saga when it's minus, because it doesn't necessarily say non-land. But the reason we were playing Teferi Time Raveler is because of its static ability. It means that they cannot interrupt our combo unless it's a creature ability. That, in conjunction with its +1, means that we can just plus it, pass the turn. If they ever do anything to interrupt our combo, then we just do it in response, because we can do it during our opponent's turn. But ideally, we do it on their end step. We creativity for 2 or something like that on their end step. Trigger the Archons. They can't interact with us because of the static ability on Teferi Time Raveler. Untap, attack with the Archons. It is so, so good. And then besides the static ability, interrupting Cascade decks. Now, as far as other interaction, we're playing 3 Reprieve. Remember, we are like a control combo deck. 2 mana, return target spell to its owner's hand, and draw a card. I really like Reprieve over Remand because it doesn't interact, or because Veil of Summer doesn't interact with it. It technically is not countering it. It is not blue, so Mystical Dispute doesn't interact with it. And us being able to draw cards and dig deeper into our combos is hyper important. Also, again, very good against Cascade decks. You reprieve the card they're cascading into, it returns to their hand, and now what do they do with it in their hand, especially if it's Living End? Other ways we interact, Leyline Binding, one of the best removals in the format. It is 6 mana flash with Domain, costing 1 less for each basic land type among lands you control. It's very easy for us to get 5 basic land types with the Triomes and stuff, so very often it just costs 1 white. And when it enters a battlefield, exile target non-land permanent opponent controls until Leyline Binding leaves the battlefield. So instant speed, 1 mana removal that doesn't really care what it is, which is super powerful and really easy for us to cast. And I'm also playing a Prismatic Ending, just has some reasonably unconditional removal, just super mana intensive. The other card I haven't talked about in depth is Fable of the Mirror Breaker. Fable of the Mirror Breaker is an amazing card. It lets us get that goblin like we talked about earlier. It gets a 2/2 red goblin creature token whenever it attacks, create a treasure token. Both of the things really important to be able to creativity into. And also having that extra mana allows us to protect our combo and be able to interact with our opponent easier while advancing our own game plan and playing our planeswalkers and stuff like that. Its second chapter, you may discard up to 2 cards. If you do, draw that many cards. This is really amazing because, again, we're like a control combo deck. Where there's a lot of cards we might not want to play with, especially if we curve Wrenn and 6 into Fable and Mirror Breaker. Wrenn and 6 is getting back lands, which means if we draw lands, we're not playing them because we're getting back stuff, which means we almost definitely have extra lands in our hand, and we find extra lands in our hands a lot with this deck, especially with Wrenn and 6, and so we can just discard those extra lands to Fable of the Mirror Breaker and just cash them in for new cards, which is amazing. And then on its flip side, it turns into Reflection of Kiki-Jiki, which is a Goblin Shaman, 2/2. You can pay 1 mana and tap it to create a token this copy of another target non-legendary creature you control, except it has haste, and sacrifice it at the beginning of the next end step. This is, of course, amazing with Archon of Cruelty. Rarely happens, though. This is, of course, amazing with Archon of Cruelty, though rarely happens. One thing that happens a little bit more often is there's a Reflection of Kiki-Jiki combo, which you may know about, but I'm still going to explain, where if you have 2 Reflections of Kiki-Jiki, you wait until your opponent's end step, tap it, target your Reflection of Kiki-Jiki, you get a new guy. Tap it, target, get a new guy. Tap it, target, get a new guy, etc., 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 for as many mana as you can. And then you're on your opponent's end step, so the next end step is your end step. You untap, you now have a ton of 2/2s, and you can attack with all of them. And games end pretty quickly in that sense. There's also a way to juggle Reflection of Kiki-Jiki tokens. If they remove your original reflections, but you have the copies, on every end step, you can copy a few, keep them for the following turn, then copy a few, keep them for the following turn. I've only done that twice ever, and I've played hundreds of matches with this deck, and with Red, Black, Midrange, and Pioneer. But it's just like another thing to keep on your radar in mind. One other thing about the main deck that I don't think I've mentioned yet is the Triomes. Being able to cycle them for 3 mana is really relevant with Wrenn and 6. If it's not the early game and you draw a Triome, and you just want to dig through your deck, you can pay 3 mana, cycle it or whatever, and draw a card, plus Wrenn and 6 on that Triumph, get it back to your hand, just cycle it to draw a card, rinse and repeat. Very, very good. And then as far as the sideboard goes, Celestial Purge is mostly for Red-Black Scam, or Evoke, or whatever you want to call it. But also, like, decent against Jund Saga, decent against Death Shadow, you know, etc., etc. Elish Norn, we're siding in for any deck that is running extraction effects or for any deck that it totally neuters. For example, it's good against Scam, it's really good against, like, Omnath, it's really good against Titan, etc., etc. Change the equation, we're siding in against anything with things that cost 2 or less that we really, really care about, like Cascade decks, or if we want to win counter wards, like against Murktide, or against literally any green or red deck. Field of Summer is to protect against things like Grief and Thoughtseize and counterspells. Terracodon is for Tron, which is a horrid matchup, and is also decent against Amulet Titan. And Boseiju is for Tron and is our artifact and enchantment hate. However, the interesting part of creativity is there isn't really a totally stock list. There's a ton of flex slots with not a lot of agreed upon correct things to do, especially since the last Pro Tour. So let's look at 5-Color Creativity's flex slots. So these are the flex slots for the main deck and the sideboard in 5-Color Creativity. These are all the cards that I think are reasonable to play in these slots. Now, in the main deck, there are actually 6 flex slots, and I'll explain each one of them. Fire and Ice is really good because it's able to kill mana dorks, things against Yawgmoth. It's a decent removal. And the ice part, we get to slow down our opponent's game plan while digging through our deck, which is really powerful if we're really focused on the combo portion. Preordain is a new unban in Modern, and it might have a home in Creativity. I'm not 100% sure yet. I don't really like it. The reason I don't like it is I don't really want to be fetching Steam Vents on turn 1 unless I'm actively doing something crazy for my opponent, like the Spell Pierce. But the point of Preordain is to smooth out your draws, and fetching Steam Vents on turn 1 can very often be really detrimental to your game plan. However, being able to smooth out your draws and dig deeper and grab cards that are relevant, because we are forced to play quite a few cards that are just bad, can be very, very powerful. The 4th Spell Pierce is a flex slot. I've already explained the significance of Spell Pierce. Flame Slash is just like a really good all-around removal spell, is like pretty good against Scam, reasonable against Murktide, obviously fine against Burn and Omnath and Hammer Time, Yawgmoth, etc., etc. It's just like another solid removal spell. I've already talked about what we're previous for. Persist. Oh, there should be 2 Persist here. My bad. Pretend there's 2 Persist there. Persist is a really interesting card. At one point, there was a Jund Creativity deck where they would play Bitter Reunion, be able to discard a target, and then persist it. But people are still playing Persist just as a flex slot. I think Persist is really good if you plan on playing against a lot of decks and having really, really long games. You know, it's really good if you like discard your Archons to Fable, which happens a lot. If like you plan on your Archons being answered, you can persist, bring them back. It's all pretty good, but it's mostly for these like super, super grindy decks. The fourth, Teferi, I think is a flex slot. I've already talked about the significance of Teferi. Prismari Command is kind of an interesting card where none of the modes are good, but being able to do 2 of them makes the card pretty powerful. It's a reasonable removal with 2 damage to any target. Being able to draw 2 cards and discard 2 cards puts it in a similar category for me as Fire and Ice, where, you know, we can kind of dig through our deck a little bit faster. And then creating a treasure token not only ramps your mana, but also lets you creativity a little bit easier by targeting the treasure token. All of this at instant speed can be pretty powerful. Also, the fourth thing, I've totally forgot about it, is destroy target artifacts. So having that main deck artifact hate might be powerful in like a Hammer Time format, especially since this card is good against other decks that are not Hammer Time. The Transmogrify is becoming a flex slot, but we've already talked about the point of Transmogrify. I like the 5 combo pieces, but some people are just going down to the creativities. Fourth Archon is a flex slot. Benefits of fourth Archon is if you play against really long games, being able to cast them is a lot easier. Also, decks like Omnath can just like exile answer your Archons with Solitudes and whatever, and like Leyline Bindings, and make it so you just like have nothing to creativity into, and just like having more Archons can often be better against decks like that. And then 2 Prismatic Commands are flex slots. It's just unconditional removal. We've already talked about it. So of these cards, you pick 6 to play in your main deck. And it isn't really decided what the best 6 are. These are my 6 that I play. I just really strongly feel I want to interact with my opponent super heavily. I want to interact on the stack, and I'm afraid of Cascade decks. I like this. Teferi means I don't have to interact with them. I just get to control the stack. And again, good against these Cascade decks. Transmogrify, I've always liked the 5th number of combo pieces because, again, the point of the deck is comboing. And then I really like the unconditional removal of Prismatic Ending. And while I'm sold on these cards being in flex slots, I could totally see this being like a one of Fire and Ice or a Prismatic Command or a Flame Slash or something like that pretty easily. Maybe even a 4th Archon. You know, this is the one I'm not entirely sold on as far as my 75 goes, but I really love these ones. But any 6 of these is correct. I think if you do Preordain, you're supposed to do all 4. But I think that's really the only restriction. Now, as far as sideboarding flex slots, let's get this stuff out of the way. As far as sideboarding flex slots, there are so many different cards to pick for your sideboard. Blossoming Calm for burn, also like fine against grief and stuff. Silence, excellent against scam because you can kind of stop the grief combo. You just do it in response to grief and they can't undie it. Really good against cascade. They cascade and you just cast silence before they can cast the thing they're cascading into. Also reasonable to like kind of clear the way for your combo, you know, against like counterspell decks and whatever. Celestial Purge, we've already talked about. Hallowed Moonlight is really good against these Cascade decks because it's a 2-mana instant. Until end of turn, if a creature would enter the battlefield and it wasn't cast, exile it instead and draw a card. It replaces itself, like, at worst, so it's pretty good against these Cascade decks. It's also against Living End. It just wins the game. Solid against Rhinos. Some people side it in against Scam for the like undying effects. I'm not into that personally. But the big reason people were playing this was the popularity of the Mirror Match. The issue is that this creativity deck has gone down pretty dramatically in popularity. So the plane of Hallowed Moonlight has gone down pretty dramatically in popularity. And there are other ways and better ways to deal with Cascade decks. We'd rather deal with it on the stack. Now, if creativity becomes popular again, Hallowed Moonlight will probably find its way into sideboards again. Elesh Norn, Mother of Machines, we've already talked about. Iona is an interesting one. It's really good against decks that really rely on a single color in order to win the game. It's a 7/7. It's just another target that you can creativity into for us. And as a battlefield, choose a color. Your opponents can't cast spells with a chosen color. Obviously insane against things like Burn. Really good against things like Murktide. Really good against Amulet Titan. Can be good against Crashing Footfalls. Really good against Living End. You know, etc., etc. I already talked about change the equation. Alpine Moon is for Tron. The weird part about it is I don't really like it a ton against Tron, but the Tron matchup is so ridiculously bad that anything that can shore it up at all is probably worth it. So that's why people play Alpine Moon. Strike It Rich and Abundant Growth sort of go into the same category, but people play them for different reasons. They're both like ways to beat Blood Moon. Strike It Rich being 1 mana, create a treasure token, flashback for 3 mana. Abundant Growth is 1 mana enchantment. When you enchant a land, and when it enters the battlefield, draw a card. Enchanted land has tap, add 1 mana of any color. Now, the benefits of Strike It Rich is it allows mana ramp, and you can creativity the treasure tokens, which is both really, really good. The issue is when you use the treasure tokens, they're gone. Abundant Growth smooths out draws because you draw a card, and lets the land tap for any color. So you can just like fetch Stomping Grounds, Abundant Growth. Now that land is a rainbow land, and we get to draw a card and dig a little bit deeper. The issue is you can creativity Abundant Growth, and it doesn't necessarily ramp you mana. It's just smoother. But both of these are Blood Moon hate. They're normally played as one-ofs. Nature's Claim is just extra artifact and enchantment hate, a little bit better than Beseiju as far as for those specific things, especially since it's 1 mana. Also, like, totally fine decided in against burn and being able to just, like, hit your own treasure token or hit a Fable or something like that to just gain 4 life. Finding its Eidolon too. Beseiju, on the other hand, being in the same category, even though I've talked about Beseiju before, the reason you'd play Beseiju over Nature's Claim is one to hit Tron lands or Amulet Titan lands, but also you can cycle through Beseijus with Ren and 6. It's just called Beseiju Ren Loop, and keep casting Beseiju over and over. You channel it, get it back with Ren, channel it, get it back with Ren, and against decks that Beseiju is good against, it just locks them out of the game. Veil of Summer, we've already talked about why it would be good, but people play up to 4. Terra Sunder is more artifact and enchantment hate, but also you can side it in against decks you just want more removal against. It is a 2-mana instant, exile target artifact or enchantment. If the spell is kicked, exile target non-land permanent instead. So it's solid against decks you just need more removal against, like Omnath or something. Terrastodon, we've already talked about. Wear Terra, more artifact enchantment hate. Particularly good against like Urza Saga's decks and things like that. Where I talked about Beseiju. Plains, people are using very often as a siding card for if they're playing Iona in the sideboard, just so they can cast Iona if they draw it. Sundering Titan is just another creativity into card. Really good against Omnath, really good in the mirror match. I guess I didn't say what Sundering Titan does, I'm sorry. It's a 7/10. When it enters or leaves the battlefield, choose a land of each basic land type, then destroy those lands. Just like really good, can just like end the game against other 5-color decks. Void Winter is a 9-mana 11/9. Your opponent can't cast spells with even mana values. Your opponent can't block with creatures of even mana values. So these are really good against decks that are playing cards that are even mana values that we don't want them to play. Really solid against Scam because of like Grief, Orcish Bowmaster, Dothi, Voidwalker. Really good against counterspell decks. Can be okay against Tron because of Wormcoil Engine, Ulamog, Karn the Great Creator. Because people are, especially since people are going down on Karn Liberated. There's a lot of decks that's really good against. It's even good against like combo decks with even mana values like Amulet Titan or something like that. Also, 0 is even, so it's good against this Cascade decks as well. Emrakul is, our classic 15 mana, 15/15, can't be countered when you cast a spell. Take an extra turn after this one. We're never casting the spell. Flying, protection from spells that are 1 or more colors, Annihilator 6. And when Emrakul Anson is put into the graveyard from anywhere, its owner shuffles their graveyard into the library. Obviously good against Mill, which is actually really relevant. This has won me matches before against Mill, but also like really solid against decks with extraction effects. Just like a solid card to just bring in and be able to creativity into it and say deal with it. But also really good against decks that just can't answer it, don't have Leyline Binding or Solitude effects or stuff like that. So really, it's choose 15, and I don't think there are any like truly correct cards other than playing a one of Beseiju and at least 2 Veil of Summer, and the rest is really, really up for grabs, which is making this wild and making a lot of creativity decks totally different from one another, which is really fun and kind of brings out the skill of these decks. And now for everybody's favorite part, which is the sideboard guide. So what we're going to be doing is talking about how to sideboard against decks that I think are playable and reasonably popular in Modern. And right now I'm looking at MTG Goldfish, and I think we'll be going right down to blue-black control, which means we're going to talk about how to sideboard against the top 14 decks in Modern. So let's jump right into it. I've already talked about the role of these sideboard cards, so I'm not really going to be explaining why we bring them in unless it's not super obvious, but I will be explaining why we're bringing some cards out. The most popular deck in Modern is Red-Black Scam. We're going to be bringing in Celestial Purge. We're going to be bringing in Elish Norn. We're going to be bringing in Change the Equation. And we're going to be bringing in Veil of Summer. We have a giant sideboard against Scam. We do not want to lose against it. We'll be bringing out Prismatic Ending. We have enough pieces of removal, and like the things that really matter to remove, Prismatic Ending would cost a lot of mana, so we're not super into that. Transmogrify, they can just interact super easy with the removal, so we want to be able to creativity for multiple into it. I'm not a big fan of Reprieve against this deck, just because a lot of their stuff doesn't cost a ton of mana, though Reprieve is really silly against like when they evoke. I often think it's to revoke again, so like meh. We're going to be cutting Teferi Time Raveler, because by the time we can cast it, the things that Teferi is good against in the deck, like the Undying thing, has already happened, so eh. And we have enough removal to be able to deal with other stuff regarding it. And then we have a difference on play and the draw. If we're on the play, I like siding out Lightning Bolt because it's easier to interact with any of the scam strategies with Spell Pierce. If we're on the draw, I want Lightning Bolt in because I don't want to die to Regavan. And likely they have already scammed us, so we need removal for that 4/3 grief that's on the battlefield now. So on the draw, we side out Spell Pierce. And so that's how I sideboard against scam. The second most popular deck in Modern is Crashing Footfalls, also known as Rhinos. Against Rhinos, we are bringing in Change the Equation. We are bringing in Veil of Summer. That is it. And we're going to be bringing out removal, especially removal that doesn't get rid of the Rhinos, like Lightning Bolt. Prismatic Minion is a little awkward. I'm not a huge fan of it. And we're going to bring out a number of Leyline Bindings just to meet this number of cards. And that is how I sideboard against Rhinos. The third most popular deck in Modern is Murktide. Against Murktide, we are bringing in Change the Equation because even though they don't play high mana red and green cards, most of the cards in their deck, besides like Murktide, maybe Subtlety, are counterable with Change the Equation, so we're siding it in. They'll have Summer to protect against the counter magic. And we're going to be siding out of Prismatic Ending. We're going to be siding out of Transmogrified. Transmogrified is just like a super cuttable card. I'm not a big fan of Reprieve just because their stuff costs so little. They can just recast it very often. And we're going to be shaving on 2 Teferi. Teferi is really good against the counter magic and the Murktide, but like every other aspect of the deck, Teferi is pretty bad against. So it costs 3 mana. Getting that counterspelled it doesn't feel good at all. That's really bad. And I want to keep in the Lightning Bolts, which would be the other cut, and the Leyline Binding, which would be the other cut. I really don't want to die to Regavan or Murktide Regent. So this is how I sideboard against Murktide. The fourth most popular deck is Tron. This is a rough matchup. We're going to be siding and change the equation just so we can interrupt their colors by hitting a star or hit a Sylvan Scrying or anything like that. We're going to be bringing in Boseiju so we can hit their lands. And Terrastodon so we can hit their lands. Because we're bringing in 2 Terrastodon, we can shave on Archon of Cruelty. Terrastodon pretty much ends the game, to be totally honest with you. And we're going to be bringing out a whole mess of removal that doesn't really do anything against the deck. And other cards that don't really do anything, like Teferi. Teferi is kind of solid, though, because it can bounce artifacts that don't matter and stuff like that. So we're going to keep 1 in, because the Lightning Bolt and the 1 Archon are both much, much worse. So that's how I sideboard against Tron. The fifth most popular deck is Burn. Against Burn, we're bringing our Celestial Purges just to get rid of the creatures. And we're bringing Change the Equations because it can counter all these like scary burn spells. That being said, Reprieve is god-awful against Burn because everything, for the same reason, is bad against Murktide. And we're going to shave on the Wrenn and 6 because it doesn't do anything against Burn, unfortunately. And frankly, if we need to cast the Wrenn and 6 that doesn't affect the board at all to hit our land drops, then we should have mulliganed against Burn. We need other cards that actually interact with what our opponent is doing because they're just going to kill us too fast. So this is how I sideboard against Burn. The sixth most popular deck is Omnath. Against the Omnath deck, there's not a lot of cards I hate. I do like getting Prismatic Ending because it costs just a ridiculous amount of mana to be able to remove anything in our opponent's deck. I like getting Transmog just because they have a lot of really free things to be able to interact, especially removal wise. So I always want a creativity for multiple. And we're bringing in 2 Change the Equation. I think Change the Equation is reasonable against this deck. Encounter most things that we care about. I don't want to bring in too many because of Teferi Time Raveler making counter magic really weird, and also like it can't the One Ring or Leyline Binding or anything like that, but we're just gonna bring in 2. This is how I sideboard against the deck. It's a reasonable matchup though, so we feel okay about it. The 7th most popular deck is Hammer Time. Against Hammer, we are bringing in Boseijus, and we are bringing out Reprieves. For the same reason, everything costs so little, Reprieve doesn't really do much. And this is how I sideboard against Hammer Time. The 8th most popular deck in Modern is Amulet Titan. Against Amulet Titan, Elesh Norn is super good because their things don't do anything when they enter. Change the Equation counters the things that matter against this deck. Terrastodon is super silly against the dual lands. And for a similar reason, I like bringing in Boseiju because it can hit Amulet or those double lands. We bring out Lightning Bolt. Doesn't really kill anything in the deck we care about. We're going to be cutting 3 Teferis, leaving 1 in because like Teferi can be kind of rough because by the time we want to return things to their hand, it doesn't, like it's already brought the pain. But there are worse cards to bring out, like we're going to cut 2 Archons because we're bringing in a lot of targets who don't really want to draw them. And if we hit a Terrastodon, the game is likely over anyway. So this is sideboard against Amulet Titan. The 9th most popular deck is Yawgmoth. Against Yawgmoth, we are bringing in Elesh Norn because they have extraction effects, and making things like Orcish Bowmasters and stuff do less is pretty sweet. I'm a fan of Celestial Purge, even though it can't hit about half the cards in the deck. Being able to hit things like Yawgmoth and Shieldred and Orcish Bowmaster and stuff like that is probably worth it. And I'm a fan of Change the Equation Now we're going to be bringing out to fairies. Things cost so little when I return stuff to their hand. It doesn't really do a lot, and everything kind of does the same thing, and they don't really want to play at instant speed, so meh. Bringing out transmog. It's just too easy for them to interact with a single creature. And we're going to shave on spell pierces. Spell pierce can be good against things like Chord and Eldritch Evolution and stuff. I just don't think it's good enough. I'd rather just remove the creatures. So size sideboard against Yawgmoth. The 10th most popular deck is Living End. Against Living End, we're bringing in Change the Equation because we can just counter the Living End with Change the Equation. Veil of Summer for grief and counter magic. And we are cutting removal because if we need the removal, things have already gone horribly wrong and we have not done our job. We'll be the removal that we are forced to keep in will be cards that can remove giant things. So the size sideboard against Living End. The 11th most popular deck is Jund Saga. Against Jund Saga, we're bringing our Celestial Purges. It basically deals with everything but Tarmogoyf. We're bringing Change the Equations because it can counter everything in our opponent's deck. Oh my god, please. There we go. We're bringing a Veil of Summers. Oh, please. What am I doing? Oh my god, I'm having a stroke. Bringing a Veil of Summers for Thought Seizes and things like that. We're going to be cutting Transmog. They have access to so much removal that targeting one creature is not great. We're cutting Reprieve because their stuff costs so little. Returning stuff to their hand doesn't really matter. For similar reasons, we're going to be cutting Teferi. And then I'm a fan of like going really, really mid-range and just keeping all the rest of these cards in and just shaving on Spell Pierce. So I sideboard against Jund Saga. The 12th most popular deck is the Mirror Match. In the Mirror Match, we are bringing in Veil of Summer to win the Counter Wars. We're bringing in Elesh Norn because it stops our opponent's Archons from doing anything. And the big thing to understand about the Mirror is because good players will just wait until they can creativity for multiple and protect their creativity, removal doesn't work in the Mirror Match like you want it to. So I like shaving the Lightning Bolts, and just leaving it at that. I like the Prismatic Endings because it can get rid of our opponent's Wrenn and 6, and that Wrenn and 6 often really, really matters. So size sideboard in the Mirror Match. The 13th most popular deck in Modern is Death Shadow. Against Death Shadow, we are bringing in our Veil of Summers to deal with counter magic and Thoughtseize effects. We're going to be bringing in Change the Equation because it can just counter like everything in our opponent's deck. We're bringing in Celestial Purge because it can hit every creature in our opponent's deck. And we're becoming Reprieve for reasons we have stated before. Things just cost so little it doesn't matter. We're cutting Transmog because it's just so easy for them to interact with one creature. I'm also a reasonable fan of cutting Teferi. We don't really care if they play at instant speed. They don't actually play that many removal spells. And I like cutting Teferi for the same reason we cut Reprieve. And because we're bringing in removal and counter magic, I like shaving just one Lightning Bolt and one Spell Pierce. Because we're cashing in for much better versions. And that's how I sideboard against Death Shadow. And the final deck we're going to talk about how to sideboard against is Dimir Control, also known as like Blue-Black Lord of the Rings. Against this deck, we're bringing in Veil of Summer, and that is pretty much it, because none of the other cards are good against this deck. And we're going to be cutting 3 Lightning Bolts, because Lightning Bolt really only kills Orcish Bowmaster and doesn't really do anything else. So I sideboard against the Blue-Black Control deck, Blue-Black Lord of the Rings. So there is my deep dive for 5-color creativity, including a deck tech, goals, gameplay, builds, flex slots, and how to sideboard against the top 14 decks in Modern. If you like this video and want to see more videos like this, please be sure to like and subscribe. Check me out on social medias. Links are above me and in the description. Join the Discord, follow the Twitter, everything. Thank you all so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.